Welcome to This Week in South Carolina. I'm Gavin Jackson. This week we continue to look at the ramifications of election 2024, both on how the geopolitical aspects of the election have played out, as well as social media. But first, we're going to talk about geopolitical challenges and opportunities. And to do that, I'm joined by Jerry McDermott. Jerry's professor and chair of international business at the Dartmouth School of Business at the University of South Carolina. Jerry, great to be with us.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
So you are in a panel discussion this week talking about these challenges and opportunities that we're now facing as a country, as a world. Obviously, there's been a lot of leadership changes around the world, including America right now. Things are look very different come Inauguration Day on January 20th, 2025. So tell me how you see America kind of fitting into the global economy, geopolitical economy as well.
Well, America is the leader in the world economy. First of all, that's a very key thing to say, and it's to understand that not only economically it's important, but it's leadership in the shaping of these institutions, economic institutions. It's the leader in collective security arrangements, right? That's another big part of life for us. So those are regional, those are global. So the world basically, and this is in my conversations over the past year or so, when people are looking towards the elections, world leaders are often wondering, so what will happen with U.S. leadership in areas like trade and finance and in collective security? That's what they're waiting for. So they know that administrations change, and there's a shift, always a shift in policy or emphasis. But right now they're looking with a feeling of a little more uncertainty. Because maybe some of the norms or expectations are going to be broken. And so that's what's keeping people a little uneasy right now.
Yeah, so we have certainty we know who the next president will be,
right.
President President-elect Donald Trump. But what are some of those uncertainties? I mean, we're talking about tariffs and trade. I mean, there's been a lot of things discussed on the campaign trail. Is a lot of that, you think, more to just posture and maybe provoke and make people think one way or another? I mean, that instability kind of does have some ramifications in itself.
Well, your ask is, one thing is about what is the administration's strategy. We don't know that because even the cast of characters who were there in the previous 4-year period, those people are no longer there, and there's been a new team in. Though there is a little bit of continuity on the trade side, so maybe we could start with that. What do we know? We know that there's expectations, and this was even if Harris won, that the U.S. was going to basically reopen negotiations, let's have it, or a bit of pushing around with China, right, on the trade front. And we can see this already happening. This is happening in the EU too. That is, China is producing, let's say, really millions of electric vehicles at a very low price. And they are waiting in ports around Europe right now. And they would love to sell them into the US, and that's not happening either. So are there other types? Yes, there are other types of products too they want to be selling into. And so the US's position is maybe we should ramp up tariffs against China, and that will then either allow us greater access to certain parts of their market, or they will cut down on their subsidies.
But when that happens, so it could result in a trade war too. Like you're saying, they could go elsewhere. It could also sort of shift where people get their goods. I mean, even if we pivot away from EVs and we look at agriculture and maybe soybeans, which we saw a lot of ramifications of in the last Trump administration, they'll go to Brazil and say, we don't need the American Midwest. I mean, there are some really key lasting damages that could happen as a result.
Well, this is a really interesting point. There's a couple of ways to look at this. First of all, when we're thinking about China per se, and then we can get into the EU, don't think about just final goods. Think about what we call global value chains. So it's these intermediate goods, or parts of machinery, or semiconductor systems. Now, the Chinese aren't as leading in semiconductors, and that's another conversation. But the point is that it's not only final goods. And we saw the disruption in COVID. So during COVID, value chains across the world were disrupted. And what that meant is that companies couldn't get the components or the subsystems that went into their final goods. What did this do? It delayed product. It has also increased their price, right?
Vehicles.
Yeah,
really jammed
vehicles were really jammed up, but it's your computer systems could be jammed up. All of your domestic goods inside your kitchen or your TVs. These are the type of things that need lots and lots of components. Look, even footwear, right? You know, footwear, probably there's a study I was looking at, 200 people probably work on a simple sneaker.
Okay.
Yeah, running shoe, right? So the point is that once you start to lay in a place like, lay into a country like China, it's not just like their direct exports. What's happening is that other value chains will be impacted. Now, the question is, how does that adjust? Well, there'll be increase of price and delays, but there'll also be diversion, and who's going to take advantage of it? So if there's also a tit for tat, going to your point right now. So for instance, what do we know? We have a trade agreement with Canada and Mexico since 1994, right? The NAFTA, or US is MCA. And we know also that Mexico is importing cars, or you could say exporting into Mexico. And under certain agreements, those cars, and then they're building those cars too. And so if they meet the content agreements, those cars can go into the United States. Now, by the way, here's the interesting thing. Go back to Japan bashing in the 1980s. I don't know if you remember yourself, but Richard Gephardt and team were there in the early 1980s up on Capitol Hill taking a sledgehammer to different Japanese like boom boxes, right? This was the classic image because the Japanese were exporting heavily into the United States and we weren't allowing that, being allowed into their markets. So what happens? There's a number of tariff issues and negotiations, and that led to Japanese foreign direct investment heavily into the US. So then that was a very interesting adjustment over a 10 to 15 year period. By the way, South Carolina has been a big beneficiary of that. So what we're going to see also is that what has already started about 10 years ago, Chinese companies are really launching into foreign direct investment around the world, including the United States, right?
But there's also a little bit more pushback because of the Chinese being our adversaries, a spy,
Right.
and all those issues.
So
I
that's,
mean, that's
the new
difference,
element.
Yeah.
And that is the new element. But I don't think, so that my point is that when you look at the pros and cons of what could happen, look, Republican-led states are benefiting from Chinese investment and Chinese technology.
And EV investment too.
Right, right. No. But I'm saying,
Yeah.
like, you know, look at Georgia, look at Ohio. They have great investments in renewable energy technologies with major Chinese companies. No one's worried about that right now, it appears. And they're joint ventures too. So what I'm saying in terms of the politics of that is that you do have stakeholders inside the United States who are saying maybe we don't want to have the import competition, but in terms of joint investment, maybe there can be some movement for that.
So it's easier to say we're going to slap big tariffs on things versus actually realizing how it affects.
Yeah, you're going to have
Republican
trade
controls.
diversion. I think the other thing that you're talking about too is if there is real impact on certain types of agro products, yes, then you can bet Argentina and Brazil are going to benefit tremendously.
When we talk about the EU, how does that work too? I mean, we trade with the EU heavily as well, and we're talking about 10, 20, 30% taxes on goods coming in here versus the 60% to China. I mean, it's really almost isolationist to the point where it could drive up prices as well.
So the EU is a tremendous trading and investment partner. Now, I'm going to get to South Carolina in a second.
Yeah.
But the EU is a major ally, right? Or the countries are allies. And so our overlapping interests in terms of economics as well as security is centered around our relationships with EU and EU countries, including the UK. I think that every negotiation then with the EU is really multidimensional. So when you look at what are the discussions with the EU, it's going to be, yes, they may be talking about tariffs, but simultaneously there are security issues going on, movement of capital going on. So whenever you see these negotiations, I always think about there's a number of different balls in play. So they may be giving on one thing, but they're taking on another. So this is a big thing that I think there's going to be discussed. So I don't see it just as only about trade, right?
Yeah. And we also heard from Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell recently saying that we're trying to figure out where things are going, what's actually going to stick, what's actually in play versus what's just bluster. And he has said it's too early to reach any judgment here. Policymakers are going to wait longer to see what the actual effects will be when we talk about trade and tariffs. But when you were talking about just global instability, we're looking also at these strategic partnerships like NATO on the European continent, where there is a hot war. Then you have the Middle East, where there is Israeli conflict going on too. I kind of want to pivot to that kind of security issue when you're talking about the role of China, Russia, North Korea is playing and all that, and how you feel America might maybe change its approach to these wars, to how we center ourselves on the global stage, and how that could have ramifications
Let me bring
when
some
it comes
of this stuff
to
back
economy.
to home. Then.
Yeah.
Right. But before we pivot to security, I was remiss in not mentioning something more particular to South Carolina in all these discussions, because this is about South Carolina, this program. And I forgot to mention one thing. South Carolina is consistently among the top 5 states in the union for the last 25 years in every indicator of the internationalization of the economy. That means trade, that means jobs from trade, foreign direct investment, jobs from foreign direct investment, et cetera. Right? We're a leader in that. So anything that disrupts international markets is a very big disruption for the South Carolina economy. Right? So that's one of the things that's going to be interesting to see how South Carolina is maneuvering in Washington to deal with these issues. And don't forget, our biggest markets are the EU. Mexico is another big relation. Canada and China is still a big player too, and Japan. So, but on the security arrangements, so I think the biggest issue, just take a step back, because there's so many issues, there's so many balls in the air right now. We have many conflicts. The biggest issue, we can frame it like this. How will people see the new administration in terms of its consistency and confidence in its commitment to prior decades of security agreements and security relationships? So as told to me by high-level people in Asia, particularly in Korea, they are watching, once the election was going to be made, if Trump and his team were going to be in the White House, all eyes are on how they react to certain issues with commitments to allies and in the Ukraine. And the implications, and by the way, this is not just that in private conversation, you find out that there are scenario planning happening in a number of think tanks on global security. It goes like this: will there be basically a proliferation of nuclear weapons? That would be the basic point that was rammed home to me many times. And the reason why this is an issue, potentially, is that if countries feel that the collective security arrangements, and particularly with the United States, are uncertain, they have to, it's everyone for themselves. And so there are already arrangements to acquire weapons, even in secret. And I think that's the biggest issue right now. Do things fragment and create an uncertainty so that people start doing things that they would never think of doing before? And that's the first thing that I think that everybody is looking at. And I think the administration, its team, probably it sounds like Marco Rubio who's the nominee for the Secretary of State. I'm sure he and his team will be out there calming the waters to a certain degree, but also letting them know whatever the new type of accountability issues there will be towards allies from the United States. So it'll be an interesting dance for the first 6 months.
Yeah, I was going to ask you for predictions, but I feel like you maybe just gave one. We're talking about the ramifications of posturing when it comes to these global strategic agreements.
Right, and I think
we only have 30 seconds left.
Yeah. So the last thing is that what they say is they keep looking for the spring, late spring, for certain tests. What happens with Russia is a test. What happens in the Middle East is a test in terms of commitments. And if they see wavering on these commitments, that's when people say, okay, we have to invest ourselves.
And same with the economy too.
Yeah,
Strategic.
right.
Yeah.
So where are they going to be committed, or do we have to change the game?
So we're all going to wait and see.
So
I suppose.
everybody's going to be changing the game. Okay.
Well, encouraging words there. But we'll wait and see. That's what we're doing right now. We're talking about risk and uncertainty with Jerry McDermott. Thank you so much, sir. We appreciate your time. That's Jerry McDermott. He's the chair of international business at the Darla Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Joining me now to discuss the power of social media in election 2024 is Brandon Boatwright. He is the director of Clemson University's Social Media Listening Center. Brandon, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
So Brandon, before we get into some of the findings and some of the work that y'all do, tell us just a little broad overview briefly about what the Clemson Social Media Listening Center does, what you guys look for.
Sure, absolutely. So we're housed in the Department of Communication, but we're an interdisciplinary lab on campus that listens, measures, and engages in social media conversations from millions of different sources of online conversation. And that ranges from, your conventional social media platforms like Twitter, X, Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, you name it from that standpoint. But it also includes things like the blogosphere and how, impactful that can be. Online videos, podcasts, we're able to scrape any form of digital data, apply various metrics to it, and help us to understand and unpack what's happening there.
Yeah, what's the need for that? Is it just because the media landscape has become so fragmented over the past, 5, 10, 15 years that you need to start kind of getting a better gauge on what's going on out there, especially when we talk about politics?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the need for social listening transcends any discipline, with the work that we do on campus, right? Even though we're housed in communication, the work that we do in social media bleeds into public health, nursing, sociology, even environmental sciences, you name it. We work with faculty to study, the adoption rates of electric vehicles in the southeastern United States. We work with clinicians in healthcare settings to determine, what are some of the ways in which people are responding to viral challenges on TikTok that wind them getting into the hospital. So there's a wide range of applications for this, and it's because we can do so much with social media data. And as you mentioned, the landscape changes, is fragmented so much. So having a tool to be able to sift through just the cacophony of everything that's happening online, is really critically important to folks at Clemson and beyond.
And I think this, I know you're talking about a broad range of applications here too, but when we're talking about politics and look at the election, it seems like so much of that also was happening on different platforms, like, the streaming platform Twitch, or, even like YouTube, or even on Telegram. Does it become harder to get into some of those conversations, or are you still looking pretty much at those big ones that are happening on platforms like Twitter or X, as we should say, and places like Facebook?
Sure. No, it's a great question, and it's something that we obviously have to account for. When we talk about the social media landscape shifting, we're not just talking about how people use it. We're talking about, the extent to which certain platforms allow data to be accessed. So certain platforms like Snapchat, Twitch, we don't get as much data from those platforms just by nature of the data that's there. But, from what we are able to gather, we look at behavioral trends, we layer that on top of demographics, psychographic information to help us get a better picture of how people are responding to and engaging with political commentary. One of the things that was really noteworthy and important just in this last cycle was looking at how young men, gravitated toward podcasters and influencers, and how much that actually impacted their, information processing throughout the cycle.
Yeah, and talk to us a little bit more about some of those insights, some of those initial insights. We're a little bit more than 2 weeks out from the election. What were some of the big takeaways, some of the big trends, some of the things that you all found through your social media listening throughout the election cycle?
Yeah. So, on social media, it's really common to see, mainstream news platforms generating a lot of engagement. And that's something that we see on a traditional election night, or let's say a debate night or something along those lines. But something that's always interesting, or has interested me throughout this past cycle, is the prominence of influencers in these spaces who have actually outgrown the engagement rates that historical legacy media have started to see more of a trajectory in that direction, right? So things like Joe Rogan as a podcaster, and the importance of his channel and his endorsement of President-elect Trump certainly spoke to that. And I think that there's a lot to be said about, again, kind of this resistance to mainstream narratives. And now we're taking more of a influencer, opinion leadership.
Outside approach.
Yeah.
Which I think can be a little worrisome too. I mean, you're talking to someone who's in, you could say quote unquote mainstream news here, and obviously we uphold a certain set of ethics and standards, and that's not always the same thing from your other podcasters or other folks who are not in journalism per se. And that's not a bad thing. Of course, we want a diversity of voices here, but it's also worrisome because you don't know who's supporting those people. You don't know how much of the content that they're getting could be from some other sources. Maybe it's AI generated. That is probably something also that you all are looking into in terms of just the growth of how information is out there now in terms of even misinformation and what is coming, from people like those in the typical mainstream media press to those who are trying to make it work and maybe using AI generated content that we don't know anything about.
Yeah, absolutely. And when social media and Twitter in particular kind of came about, we had this, kind of pie in the sky vision of, it is going to be this democratic space, right? And in a sense, it can be, with everything kind of, all things being, ethical, right? And all things being true. But when you add in things like artificial intelligence, nefarious actors, and the proliferation of content that is designed to be intentionally misleading, or the fact that a lot of folks just don't have the digital media literacy to recognize when something is not true, and they unintentionally spread information. But the important thing here is that social media provides such low barriers to entry into the conversation that when people plug in and spread information, whether intentionally or unintentionally, anyone has the ability to become an influencer, depending on what you share and how it resonates and kind of what network you fall into.
And I think we certainly saw that in play this election cycle too, when we're talking about, one Facebook post that went incredibly viral, even so much that was part of the debate when they're talking about, Haitian immigrants eating cats and dogs in Ohio, which was false, like completely debunked. The woman who even made the post said, I didn't actually do this, like this is not true, but it kept going. And then I'm sure you also probably saw a lot of other stuff happen surrounding major events like that first assassination attempt against former President Donald Trump. We even saw things happening with hurricane disaster relief most recently with Russian bots there. I think the FBI even said that there were several false claims where they made 2 videos using FBI insignia, and they were talking about voter fraud in some of the key swing states. I mean, can you point to some of those moments, some of those big moments, and what you see happening in real time when you're listening and watching these things happen? I mean, I'm sure the misinformation just completely outweighs the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are telltale signs when you're doing like large scale data analytics like this, when you actually kind of look over the metadata, which is just, all of the data that we get when we analyze conversations. We're not just looking at what people are saying, but we're looking at, timestamps of when things were posted. And when you can find that, certain messages are being amplified because they're being posted by accounts that look the same, act the same, kind of in 1 minute equal intervals, it's pretty easy to identify like these are quote unquote bot-like accounts. Inauthentic is a more accurate term. But it's exactly right. The fact that people can go online, create information that is, factually just not true with no checks against it. And what's fascinating is that, there are people in positions of power who take that information and do not fact check it and then continue to spread that information. And that's, something that we've seen throughout this election cycle and even earlier as well.
Yeah, you saw that with Elon Musk, in July, for example, sharing on his platform an AI-generated fake audio clip of Vice President Kamala Harris celebrating Biden's decision to drop out of the race, calling herself a diversity hire. That post was viewed over 100 million times. And of course, like we said, was not fact checked. There was not a label on it. So what's the key here? I mean, is it really just, again, double checking your homework before you share something, or even saying, oh, I heard this? I mean, people really need to verify things before they even start casually mentioning, some things that they might have saw online. But is it more than that? Is it more also regulations? Do we need to see just people to become more media literate? What do you think the solution is to this? Because it seems like we're just racing to the bottom here.
Yeah, well, and there's no perfect solution. These social media companies and the ecosystems that they have built, it creates this sense of whack-a-mole. One problem comes up before we can have a chance to address another. And to that extent, I don't necessarily believe that we can rely on things like regulation or social media companies to be able to moderate content at the pace at which it is generated. What I think is important is for us to be able to have more intentional conversations about how we process and consume online information, the importance that we place on teaching our kids about what it is that they're looking at online, and how to recognize things that are real and false. But also, again, doing our due diligence ourselves, not just consuming one piece of content and assuming it to be true. If we had one, tweet that we saw from the other end of the political spectrum, I'm not going to look at that potentially and say, oh, I think that's right, just because someone said it. So why do we not kind of challenge our own understanding and challenge our own confirmation biases when we look at social media content as well?
Yeah, definitely need to be aware of that and all the echo chambers that we can exist in. Got to get out of those and read some different sources. Maybe read a newspaper, watch ETV, I don't know.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's a great way to go about it.
Yeah, well, that's Brandon Boatwright. He's director of Clemson University's Social Media Listening Center. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you, Gavin. Appreciate it.
And thanks, y'all, for watching. That's our show for this week. For South Carolina ETV, I'm Gavin Jackson. Be well, South Carolina.